All right, so we are going to have a presentation is going to be about the landscape of veterinary and animal legislation with Loren Breen, who's the Director of Policy and Research at the Animal Policy Group. Loren is the Director of Policy and Research at the Animal Policy Group. She works with founder and CEO Mark Cushing to develop policy strategies and build strong coalitions to increase veterinary access and advocate for animal welfare. She conducts in-depth research and analyzes national legislative and regulatory affairs. Loren has her master's in public policy while obtaining her degree at the University of Arizona. She taught Introduction to Statistics for the Social Sciences and interned at the Arizona House of Representatives. I love statistics, even though everybody can create their own statistics. Anyway, I'm going to hand it over to you, Loren.
Thank you, Stacy. I also love statistics. So I'm Loren Breen. Thanks for the introduction. And I'm going to talk about the landscape of veterinary and animal legislation. Okay. So we're a small firm and we review about 25,000 bills for the 2-year legislative cycle, though most states have a 1-year session. In this session, we tracked about 2,000 bills we thought would be impactful to the veterinary and animal welfare industry. We do this by setting up query terms and categorized sheets to hit any keywords we think are important. And we also review all state registers. They're published weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, state vet and farm boards, and we keep an eye on Canada and Puerto Rico. And I'm sure there are a lot of people who find the bill process really boring or tedious. I happen to love it, but I do think it's important to see what solutions other states are offering or roadblocks that are popping up. So we all know there's a shortage and this limits access to care. And a 2023 Jim Lloyd study predicts that pet healthcare service spending is expected to increase 3 to 4% per year beyond inflation over the next 10 years. Currently, the number of pet-owning U.S. households increases by 1.5%, and the demand for pet healthcare services is increasing by 6% annually. So more than 12,000 companion vets are expected to retire in the next 10 years. And that means up to 55,000 new veterinarians are needed to meet projected demand. And it would take more than 30 years of graduates to meet this demand. And even with the new projected graduates expected over the next 10 years, that leaves a shortage of about 25,000 companion animal vets. So I want to talk about initiatives we've seen this session that aim to increase access to care. So one is vet tech expansion. And there are 2 unique bills I want to bring up first. There was an FDA rule that went into effect in June, making all antibiotics prescription only. So this, combined with the shortage, spurred states to consider ways to increase access. Arkansas passed a bill creating a veterinary technician specialist. This bill allows VTSs to establish a temporary VCPR, but requires the collaborating veterinarian to see the animal within 15 days of that establishment. Originally, the bill allowed the VTSs to prescribe, administer, and dispense medication, but that was amended out. The bill does allow for them to administer and dispense controlled substances, but only if the DEA grants veterinary technicians that authority. They must also operate under a collaborative agreement with supervising vets. California passed a bill that will allow vet techs to establish a VCPR either in clinic or remotely for the purposes of administering certain vaccines, so long as a veterinarian is in the general vicinity. We also saw 12 bills related to vet tech licensing, including Iowa, who passed theirs, and we'll talk more about vet tech licensure in a few slides. Prohibitions on non-compete agreements became a top issue this year. The FTC considered a national ban, and Congress is considering 3 bills. States piggybacked on the federal action, and we saw 37 bills across 17 states. Minnesota and New York passed theirs, as did California, which will codify their existing judicial decision. And we saw Maine and New Mexico join Massachusetts in considering veterinary-specific bills, and Maine passed theirs. Creating or expanding veterinary student loan repayment programs emerged as a top issue in 2022, and this trend has continued into this session. We saw 23 bills and 2 bills in Congress. So Colorado, Missouri, and Texas passed their bills expanding their programs to increase eligibility, and Utah established a new program. The Utah bill originally had no specific criteria, but it was amended to apply to shortage areas. Arkansas passed a bill creating a scholarship program to encourage veterinarians to relocate to the state and to encourage new clinics in rural areas. On the regulatory side, Utah considered rules to implement its student loan repayment program. And then we also have the hot topic of the session, which is telemedicine. So we saw 20 bills, and we saw action in both directions. So Illinois, Kentucky, and New Jersey introduced restrictive bills, which maintain the status quo and require a physical exam to establish the VCPR. Both Illinois and Kentucky passed. Arizona, Arkansas, California, Michigan, New York, and Tennessee introduced progressive bills allowing for the VCPR to be established by a virtual exam. Tennessee's bill was for livestock only. California and Arizona passed their bills, and both have been signed by the governor. Arizona's goes into effect at the end of this month. Michigan introduced their bill last month, and this comes after regulatory action, and Michigan changed their rules to require a physical exam earlier this year. Florida introduced conflicting bills, and Delaware passed a bill that does not clarify. On the regulatory side, we also saw Oklahoma and Washington clarify that a physical exam is required. New York is also proposing a few changes to their language, including restricting prescriptions written under a VCPR to 30 days, with no refill, and requiring the veterinarian to be available for in-person follow-ups. This is a comparison of the specifics of the two progressive bills that have passed and Michigan, which is still in play. So they all require client consent and prohibit controlled substances from being prescribed. California additionally prohibits xylazine prescriptions. Both Arizona and Michigan allow for a 14-day prescription with one refill, and California allows for 6 months in a refill. It does not apply for Arizona food animals, and Michigan is also limited to companion animals, while California has a 14-day maximum for antimicrobial drugs for use in food animals. Both California and Arizona require the vet to be licensed in-state. So we put together a map detailing where states stand with VCPR language. So New York currently doesn't have official language in their statute or rules. Then we have the 9 states where language expressly prohibits the establishment of a VCPR through telemedicine. Most of our states fall into these two categories. The map on the left shows states where a VCPR requires the vet to have recently seen or be acquainted with the animal. And the map on the right shows states whose language uses the term physical exam. And some people like to argue that there's potentially some wiggle room in the first group. And this brings us to our 5 states where virtual establishment of a VCPR is allowed. So of these, New Jersey and Virginia have prescription exceptions. During COVID, we also tracked emergency orders that affected this. The most have been rescinded, and the 2 that remain didn't make significant changes. There's 4 other states that passed initiatives I want to point out. Florida passed bills allowing for out-of-state licensed veterinarians to provide volunteer spay, neuter, and preventative care while in the state without obtaining a Florida license, and some people in this conference are responsible for this bill. Maryland also passed bills allowing veterinarians to provide routine care to shelters without obtaining a state license. New Mexico passed a bill requiring the veterinary board to expedite applications for out-of-state licensees, including processing the application within 30 days. Wyoming reduced their prior service requirement from 5 to 3 years. Other notable bills that were considered: Vermont considered providing $400,000 in grants to encourage veterinary clinics to stay open on evenings and weekends for emergencies. And then on the regulatory side, we have New Hampshire with a proposal and an interim rule allowing for licensure by endorsement. So we have 17 US states and DC that regulate vet techs but have no title protections stated in their Practice Act. And we also have 8 states that have no protection, as the title is not defined in the Act and thus unregulated by the state. So we tend to find that title protection and differentiation from vet assistance is really needed for retention. And we know the country is not uniform in granting title protection. So we have states where they use certification, and this is a recognition by a private sector of voluntarily achieved standards, and it's distinguished from licensure because it's generally non-governmental. Registration is the keeping of lists by practitioners by a government agency, and it can be equivalent to licensure, but it may also be distinguished from it. And then to be licensed is a statement of qualification, and it gives the right to do a thing otherwise not permitted by the given authority. And so we did see the 12 bills related to licensing vet techs. Minnesota, again, tried to pass a bill, but it failed, while Iowa did succeed in passing theirs. We have pending bills in Massachusetts and New Jersey, and Arkansas introduced a bill that would have allowed a Bachelor of Sciences in Animal Science with a pre-veterinary emphasis to qualify for licensure, though it did not pass. There were additional bills, including one related to scope in Iowa, adopting a nurse title in West Virginia, and North Carolina passed a bill prohibiting the use of the vet tech title, while a similar bill died in South Dakota. The Iowa bill was signed into law in June, and it directs the board to issue certificates of registration to RVT applicants who meet the requirements, and this codifies that language into law. Prior to this bill, their act did not outline RVTs nor define them. They did define vet assistant, and there was language in the board rules, but this will enact it in statute. The bill also defines auxiliary veterinary professionals, provides general scope, and directs the board to develop rules for specifics. Of the pending bills, Massachusetts and New Jersey are both currently non-regulated jurisdictions with CVTs. If these proposed bills pass, they implement veterinary technician licensure in Massachusetts. This would happen through a subsidiary board, while in New Jersey, it would occur through the state board. The New Jersey bill would also allow vet techs under supervision to perform any task for which the technician has been trained, as delineated in the AVMA Essential Talks list. Kentucky and New Hampshire have proposed regulations to assign tasks and level of supervision. California has proposed regulations to allow RVTs alternate routes to registration. This would remove the requirement to complete clinical practice within a 5-year maximum time frame. Washington proposed allowing VTs to become eligible for examination through a registered apprenticeship. They currently require post-secondary education, and Washington is also considering updates to task delegation. New Hampshire has adopted rules allowing for vet tech reciprocity, and they also adopted the vet nurse term. On the regulatory side, Nevada, New Hampshire, and South Carolina had vet tech and assistant rules take effect, and Washington held a hearing on proposed apprenticeship program, though it appears it's going to be challenged in court. We also track pharmacy bills in general, but there are some that directly impact the vet profession. And so we saw 11 bills across 5 states that affected veterinary prescriptions. Starting with Bowie's Law, which requires vets to discuss drug information with clients, including side effects. This year, New York amended it to restrict it to dogs, cats, and rabbits, initial prescriptions, and dispensations. And it also allows for the info to be communicated orally or written, and it delays the effective date for 18 months. We saw other state responses to the FDA rule that went into effect in June, making all antibiotics prescription only. Arkansas and Montana passed bills to help ensure that these antibiotics are still readily available. So Arkansas's solution exempts all antibiotics from the sale and shipping requirements, while Montana created a veterinary retail facility permit and veterinary dispensing technicians to allow livestock stores to continue to sell prescription antibiotics. We saw 17 additional bills in states and Congress related to antibiotics. Xylazine took center stage, so we saw 23 bills this session in 10 states and Congress that would either schedule xylazine, make it illegal to sell, distribute, or possess without a veterinary prescription. We also saw regulatory action in 5 states. Delaware, Ohio, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia have scheduled xylazine. Minnesota also passed a bill creating a One Health antimicrobial stewardship collaborative, and it includes working with veterinary clinics on appropriate prescribing to prevent transmission of antimicrobial resistant microbes. California is still considering a bill declaring that would allow the secretary to have final authority over feed additives for livestock. West Virginia and Wyoming introduced resolutions condemning the FDA rule, Illinois would have required reporting and a reduction of antibiotic use. New York also considered a similar reduction, as well as a ban on any non-therapeutic uses. North Carolina introduced a bill to study the use of antibiotics, and Congress is considering 4 bills, one of which would repeal the FDA rule, another that would monitor usage, and one that would require reporting, and lastly, one that bans non-therapeutic uses. We see states continue to adjust their prescription monitoring programs, and we see action on both sides of this issue. So after several attempts, Alaska finally passed their bill exempting vets from the PMP. But on the flip side, Maryland and Oregon have joined New Jersey in considering bills that would add veterinarians to the PMP. They have not passed, and the New Jersey bill is still pending. North Carolina passed a bill adding gabapentin to the PMP reporting, and that'll be effective in 2025. We saw Maine adopt compounding rules for veterinary office use, and New York considered 2 bills to allow pharmacies to compound for veterinary stock. Going to opioid and controlled substances specific to veterinarians, this activity continues to drop off after states ran into issues during COVID, but requiring practitioners to discuss the risk of opioids is the most popular trend right now. 3 bills were introduced to restrict dosage, and 4 states considered bills related to opioid labeling. Another pharma issue is CBD and animal products. So this issue saw a drop off in activity after California and Utah passed bills last year. We saw 4 bills, one in Rhode Island, and they were considering bills adding animals to their medicinal cannabis laws. A bill in Maine required cannabis dispensaries to post a sign stating that it was harmful to animals, even in residual amounts, but all 4 of those have died. So the 2018 Farm Bill stated that cannabis plants and derivatives from industrial hemp containing less than 0.3% THC are no longer controlled substances under the Controlled Substance Authority. So this explicitly gives the FDA authority to regulate cannabis and industrial hemp products. And one really impactful CBD bill we saw last year was in California. The highlights of the cannabis guidelines they put out are the vet must establish and document a VCPR. And the things the vet can do is discuss or recommend the use of cannabis on an animal for potential therapeutic effects or health supplement purposes, unless that veterinarian is employed or has an agreement with a cannabis license. They can also discuss, recommend, administer, and dispense hemp-derived CBD pet products as long as they're formulated in accordance with AB 45 requirements, but they cannot dispense or administer cannabis or cannabis products to an animal patient. In the past few years, we've also seen a few other bills that allow for consult, discussion, recommendation, or administration. Most states have cautionary language towards NAP CBD. A lot of them are silent. And then the third most popular thing is prohibiting it all out. Well, we have 3 states that are permissive and 4 are explicit that it is legal. For animal welfare, declawing, ear cropping, tail docking, and devocalization continue to be popular trends. Though there were a lot of bills introduced, most did not pass. New Jersey and New York considered prohibitions. Minnesota introduced a bill prohibiting landlords from requiring declawing. And in the other direction, Missouri and Texas considered bills creating a state preemption over veterinary medicine to prevent these things, or adopting declawing ordinances, and the Texas bill did pass. States continue to find ways to increase pet ownership and access. So Florida passed a bill prohibiting restrictions on weight or size. They previously had a breed-based ban in place. And then Iowa moved a breed-based ban this year, but it failed to get passed. Pet insurance saw a major uptick. We saw over triple the bills that we saw in 2022. And more impressively is that 8 of them passed. The language is rather consistent across all states. It's the Model Pet Insurance Act, except Mississippi, who deferred several of the provisions to the commission to develop through the rules process. Additionally, more states are considering breed-based insurance policies. So looking at shelter services and increasing access, Hawaii passed a resolution directing the Humane Society to develop a program offering low-income individuals veterinary services. Texas moved a similar bill, which was amended to narrow the definition of low income. It passed the House, but failed to get out of the Senate committee. Maryland passed companion bills, allowing veterinarians to provide services to shelters without obtaining a Maryland license. And the Montana Senate passed a bill exempting shelters from the Veterinary Practice Act, so they could provide services, but it did fail in the House. On the regulatory side, Washington finalized their language implementing the bill passed last year, allowing shelters to provide veterinary services to low-income individuals. So the way I was invited to speak at this panel is I joined the Veterinary Spay Neuter Alliance Task Force in the past year to answer questions about reciprocity, which is a legislative or regulatory trend I would like to see increase a lot. So the country is not uniform in its prior service requirements. So we have a heat map, and green states are where there's no prior service requirement. And it's on a spectrum to states that are very restrictive, who require at least 10 years. So restricting reciprocity, or the veterinarian's ability to transition with ease, adds to our access to care problem. So this is a profession with a large ratio of women practicing, and strict endorsement laws discriminate against women who may take maternity leave, or really any person who pauses practicing for health-related issues. And easing the prior service requirements and facilitating reciprocity is just one tool we have to increase access to care. And I hope you found this informative and not too boring. And if you did, hopefully at least you were impressed by my PowerPoint skills that I learned on TikTok in order to create this. I'm here for questions, and then any further questions that need maybe a longer explanation, you can email me, and my email's on the screen.
Excellent, excellent.
Thanks.
I am stuck. Can you go back on the slide? I'm stuck on me and my maps. Bree's going to be laughing in the background. I love the maps. Can you go back to the, well, yeah, that's beautiful too, but the map of the country. Okay. When you were talking about reciprocity here, can you explain to me more specifically what because, we've talked about actually Pennsylvania and even like Florida, they allow reciprocity up to, like, you can go there for 10 days without getting a license, right? So, but like Vermont, you can't practice without a license in Vermont. So you have to go get a full license. You can't go there on holiday and do a spay neuter. So can you just clearly define for me what the colors mean exactly?
Yeah, so this isn't for temporary licensure, it's for permanent licensure. But if a state is red, it means you need 10 years of prior service before you can apply for licensure in that state. So the lighter red is 5 years, then we go to orange at 3, and all the way to green with 1 year or no prior service restriction. And these do vary. So maybe you have an orange state where the prior service restriction is 3 years, but that could mean 3 of the last 5. So sometimes there's a little more wiggle room where they have a year stipulation, but it's within a certain range. But other states we see require you to have been practicing immediately 5 years before moving to that state for reciprocal licensure. Otherwise, you have to retake the exam.
I got you. Okay. So if I'm licensed in Massachusetts and I want to move to Pennsylvania, I have to have been working in Massachusetts for 10 years to.
I think Pennsylvania is a 5-year one. The red's a little hard to distinguish, but yes.
Oh, yeah, 5 years. Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. So I'm understanding this better. But if I get licensed in Massachusetts and I want to move up to Vermont, I can do it like 6 months after I've graduated and gotten my license in Massachusetts.
Yeah, and so and this is the other thing, most graduates can move to a place upon graduating and get their licensure without retaking an exam in a different state. So it kind of doesn't make sense if I've been practicing vet medicine for 10 years, but I took the last year off and I will have to retake that exam, but a new student wouldn't. And there are some regional exceptions. So some states will say, oh, we'll give reciprocity to these 3 surrounding states as long as their standards are similar.
It's definitely not black and white. This is why we have the multiple colors here for sure.
Yeah, so state legislation and regulation is pretty tricky in every field because it's just regulated so differently in each state.
Yeah, for sure. So here's some questions from our audience. How can you begin to get involved in helping change legislation in your county or state?
That's a great question. So there's people who feel really driven to create a bill themselves. And in that case, you would want to contact your legislators and find someone who will sponsor your bill. Other times, your vet board or your veterinary medical association might be calling for people to help with legislative tasks. And one, probably the most accessible way to help is if you are aware of legislation that's occurring, you can testify at a lot of those hearings or even just submit comments, and you can rally your friends. So recently we saw North Carolina's passing some veterinary facility legislation that's really not what the vets want. And ideally, you could rally everyone at your practice or everyone in 10 practices, and they can all submit comments. And ideally, if a board were to hear 100 veterinarians against this and no veterinarians for it, they would consider changing that language, but that doesn't always happen. But in most cases, if you have a strong presence in the hearing or by submitting comments, they'll at least consider it because, as we all know, legislators mostly aren't veterinarians. So they don't really understand what they're legislating all the time.
Well, and I would say, I don't even think we know what we're supporting all the time either, because, you know, some spay neuter legislation could look like one thing in one state and then it would be something else in another state because it's supervised by, you know, this department versus this department. So just because it's called a spay neuter bill, they still don't look alike, right?
Definitely. And yeah, some can even be tricky. And we'll see bills where something's amended in the last minute and it completely derails the bill or does the opposite of its intention. So it is a really tedious process of reading through these bills. And it can have a learning curve because often you'll see a bill introduced and it won't really have the full language because it's amending just a section. So you may see one sentence, but that sentence could entirely change the whole chapter or section that it's amending without that being readily available upon the first read.
So, you know, if someone is interested in trying to get low-income vet services or spay neuter legislation introduced, say it's a state, maybe it's a checkoff on the tax return, maybe it's a spay neuter license plate, maybe it's, you know, allocating general funding to help support spay neuter. Again, is there a specific recommendation or organization? I mean, maybe they reach out to you all first to see what's going on, and then you know, see what they can do. I mean, is it possible for an individual to do this on their own, I guess is the question.
Yes, but they would want a lot of time and want a lot of dedication because if you're not a lobbying firm and you don't have a lot of money, it is really hard to get in and meet legislators, especially if they're not your own legislator. So yes, you can definitely reach out to us. We're not a lobbying firm, and I don't know each state's group that's going to be able to help you out, but if you email me, I can find out, and I can find those coalitions or grassroots movements that may help you to connect with the people who do have a greater impact in that state. And we also just hired a chief of staff on with us. We're a really small firm, but her background is as a vet tech. So it's bringing a lot of professional insight and personal insight into what we do from the legislative aspect, because she has an idea of how these things actually impact people.
Has your group undertaken to create a program of desirable legislation that states should strive for to increase access to services and especially to promote low-cost spay neuter services? Our state has done very little, and we're trying to develop a list of desirable measures that our state could implement to expand low-cost spay neuter services in order to shop this around to legislators.
So we don't currently have an initiative specific to spay neuter, but we are working on a reciprocity initiative, both legislative and regulatory. Also on the telemedicine side, we have a big hand with passing those pro-electronic VCPR bills. And in a slightly related task, we are also very interested in vet techs being able to assist in euthanasia.
Excellent. I would be curious to know what the group's thoughts are about telemedicine. Does that help us or does that hurt us? So I just put that in that questions box.
Yeah, I would
Just
also love to hear because I know it's pretty divisive.
Yeah, so just go like for telemedicine, not for telemedicine. Everybody's quiet. So let me see here. I'm trying to, anybody got an opinion on, oh, here we go. We have for, not for. So we've got 3 fours and 1 not for, and lots of abstaining for. This is my rough polling here. I would say now we've got enough people responding here. We've got a strong leaning for telemedicine.
Okay, and so one thing we've seen with each bill is that it's introduced and then it really does get amended a lot because more and more people will weigh in. So we see prescription things amended a lot or being very different. 14 days is very different from 6 months. In Arizona and California, the AVMA also ended up testifying as neutral. They were brought to the table and they had demands they wanted met.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that I'm just trying to think about the telemedicine, and cats in specifically because cats get very stressed going to see the vet, right? And we also have our community cats too out there. And so, does telemedicine enable us to get resources to cats that we might, I hate to say it, but like delay the stress of going to a veterinarian because it's added stress and it might be an issue that's more easily resolved. We live in a video world now. So there's video, yeah. There's so much more that we can do to help with a virtual diagnosis that from a cat standpoint, I can see telemedicine being a great resource. And then again, it's also a potential time savings within the in-clinic situation too, to buy some time, more time, in a clinic. So, which is precious.
Yeah, so I think those are great points. And in addition to it being good for a cat who might be stressed out, it also sometimes is the only tool some people have. So maybe a person has limited mobility or is a little older or transportation mobility, or everyone in the family works and they don't have that extra time to make it to a vet during vet hours. So sometimes this is the only way pets can get access. And for me, I think that was the most important point to me, is that you're getting pets care who may never get care otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we have a couple of questions in from our organizers and panelists too. They're getting into the conversation. Actually, if your contact information was on that last slide, you can feel free to leave the map that I love. Okay, so Ken, has your organization or have you worked on feeding bans or other feral cat legislation?
Not that I'm aware of, no. So by feeding bans, it would be, sorry, I'm not even really familiar. There's initiatives to ban people from feeding stray cats.
Correct. So like if people are feeding a colony of cats at a public park, or I mean, there's private feeding bans, meaning, I own this apartment building, you're feeding cats by the dumpster. There's a feeding ban that's private. But then there's also communities that have legislation that do not allow people to feed outdoor cats unless they're like a registered feeder. The cats are on record, they have cat licensing. And in some cases, they've just outright said you're not allowed to feed cats because we consider them wildlife and you shouldn't feed wildlife.
Wow, no. So do those tend to be more local ordinances versus state level legislation?
I I've it's on county level, I would
Okay.
say. Up and Dr. Becky, this is her question. She says yes. She's responding to you. Yes.
So
Um,
we definitely have a harder time tracking local ordinances because there's not a really reliable database. But again, I'm not familiar with this issue, if it is something that's important to someone, you can always reach out to me, and it is something that I can help you find resources or point you in the right direction.
I have a feeling it may even be an issue in the maybe the more rural areas too. There was a situation, a big story. Oh, everybody's going to help me in the audience on this one. It was like Alabama or Mississippi, somewhere down south, and two ladies were feeding feral cats and trapping them in a park, and they very publicly got arrested for this. And there was a big brouhaha, and they had been told that they were not allowed to feed there. And I don't know if there was a specific feeding ban in the community legislatively, but there was definitely something that the line that they were crossing over, but they weren't doing anything about the cats. The cats were still there. Anyway, so feeding bans are definitely something that does not produce a positive outcome, I think, at
Right.
the end of it. And I do think that cat licensing as well as feeding bans, it's funny. It's like, they a county kind of goes one way or the other way. It's like, okay, so we really go forward and create, we acknowledge we're a spay neuter desert. Let's work to build our spay neuter capacity. Do some of the things that Karen Little was talking about, was talking strategically and providing enough spay neuter, for the community at large, and working with the county progressively that way. Or it's like, oh, there's just so many cats, there's no way we're going to do it. So let's just pretend like they don't exist and don't let people feed them, and make everybody license their cat, but they're not going to be able to enforce doing anything with those outdoor cats. So you can have legislation out there, but then there's no the like, and then what happens after that, right? So that's a big issue that I see, is that there's a lot of laws passed or initiatives passed, but then the aftermath hasn't been thought about at all.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common.
Unfortunately. I have another
Yeah.
question here from the expert crowd over here. What are the chances of getting an equivalent to a physician's assistant?
Um, I really don't know. I feel like I joined this firm about 3 years ago, and when I came on, it felt like vet nurse was like the hot topic. And it feels like that initiative has really dropped off. I know back then it received a lot of pushback, so maybe the industry's changed and it's a little more open to it. But I do know in Colorado, it didn't get introduced, but there was a pre-file for a bill, and it's coming back this year to talk about more mid-level practitioners.
Right, right. And I certainly do support, and I feel very strongly that the veterinary technicians, certified, uncertified, I just think that that profession needs to be elevated and respected at a different level, and supported and encouraged, as we should support and encourage all of our staff members,
Right.
veterinarian, technician, practice manager, front desk person. I mean, I'm hearing all these terrible stories about the front desk people that are getting the brunt of people's struggles and challenges and getting the assistance that they need for their pets and that kind of thing. So, just trying to elevate the status of the staffing profession, rather than maybe elevating the status of our corporate culture. It's elevating the status of the profession itself and all the layers that are involved with that. And I think by really clarifying what everybody's able to do in those
Mhm.
at those levels is only going to help elevate that status. And and some organizations too, it's having the veterinary technician is like the primary connector with the client.
Right.
They're the ones spending 45 minutes with the person, listening about what Marbles does, jumping on the table or doesn't use the litter box or whatever, listening to all the details, being that detective, and then the veterinarian is being brought in as the sort of the expert consultant, but they're not spending 45 minutes to drill down to what would be the key issues. And
Right.
that's powerful. I think that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point on like having the tasks clearly laid out, because one thing just anecdotally I've heard is people feel like they're not being used to their full capacity often. And when it's vague, it leaves room for maybe not giving someone a lot of flexibility in what they're able to do. But when it's clear, it's nice to see that they're able to do all these things.
All right, here. Any movement to getting laws requiring pets to be spayed or neutered in apartment complexes, etc.?
Yeah, so we did, I think we covered one. Was it spay neuter? No, I guess it was just declaw and devocalization. Not that I know of, actually, off the top of my head.
What do you think about the importance of visual design and communication strategies and the role they play in the success of the passing of new bills and community involvement?
As far as design, I don't see that often. I don't think many people, some people come and testify with some PowerPoints, but most of it really is just like a redlined language and a bunch of paper with just red lines and new blue language. So I don't know how much like design or fancy PowerPoints help to get that passed. I think with the second part of the question, community advocacy is always big. There's always power in numbers. But then there is always the bills that they're just not going to move on. Did I answer all of that question?
We will see. They can follow up if they want. Dr. Becky's got a link in there. Kristen, if you might throw that out to the whole group. She's got some commentary going on in the background, and that would be great for folks to see that. Here's another question. So any other legislation to ban the sale of cats and puppies in pet stores?
We haven't seen as much on the pet ban legislation for mammals. It's becoming increasingly popular for reptiles or guinea pigs, so smaller mammals. But I think after the initial ones, major chains took out the ability to buy cats or dogs in pet stores. So they're mostly adoptions, but it's definitely less of a hot topic now that it's not as widespread. But I think it is an issue that will remain, and there will always be people pressing for it.
Mm-hmm. So we also have a comment in here. It says, in most places, landlords can require all pets to be fixed. So on a private side initiative, if they're the property owner, they can require that. I also think they usually require proof of vaccination. It's almost the rabies is more important than the spay neuter to a certain. Well, they want the spay neuter because they don't want the cat spraying, indoors.
Right.
So that would make sense. But also the rabies vaccine is usually just a sort of a standard requirement across the board.
Yeah.
So anyway, great. Well, I think I've got all the questions covered here. And Loren, thank you so much.